am here from CloudHealth. I'm a solutions engineer, and today we're going to talk about financial management within this complexity of the Kubernetes infrastructure that several presenters have already gone through. I'm going to focus on 5 key questions that we often hear from our customers and within the industry as they're trying to solve this cost management challenge within the complexity of a Kubernetes environment. So going into the cloud maturity model is something that we often talk about with customers, and we see this journey for customers, whether you're in a startup phase or at an enterprise customer. A lot of the time that we're starting with this visibility phase, and then we go into optimization, and then we identify how can we start to put some governance and automation in place within the different teams, the different projects that we have running, and then tying that back into the different business integrations, maybe tying it back into a ServiceNow, or being able to create a workflow with the ticketing systems that you guys have as well, in order to ensure that optimization is continuing to happen, or any cost spikes that individual or that team who's the owner of that infrastructure is going to be able to go ahead and mitigate the increase within that cloud bill. So today I'm going to focus on the visibility and the optimization phases, and that we'll talk about a little bit more of how we can start to gain back that visibility of the cost per pod or per namespace, and then different areas of optimization as well. This is going to be, obviously, as we start to modernize our applications, we are talking more and more with the developer persona. Traditionally, we're talking to finance individuals. We started to see the persona of a cloud operations. And then you see this concept of a cloud center of excellence. So now we're getting individuals from the development world, from the DevOps world, from the cloud architecture, CTO, finance. So you're going to have these different personas now coming together and being able to communicate with each other, talk the same language, and then in return being able to start to close out that cost of the business while we're still thinking about that consumption-based model within these public cloud providers. And now getting into the 5 key questions. The first question that we are often trying to solve and work with customers to solve is, what are my costs per namespace? What are my costs per pod label? And those can mean different things for different personas within the organization. So you're going to be seeing, here are all of my microservices that are running within my cluster, whether it's a production cluster, whether it's a development cluster. And then you have this finance team that's saying, okay, I understand that we've made an architecture change, but I still need to know what the cost of product A is, what the cost of product B is. This is going to, in return, identify where is that revenue stream coming from and where are we spending our money. We have a cloud bill that's running us $50,000 a month, maybe even higher. We still need to be able to allocate that cost back to the business and understand if this is a good investment or is this a bad investment. So being able to start to answer those questions and help those different teams start to allocate those costs. This is something that we do within CloudHealth. CloudHealth is just one of the solutions that are out there, so I'm using this as an example. So what you're seeing here is we can deliver a report that's going to be a container cost history. We're showing it at the daily interval, and what this is giving back to the team is a cost per namespace, which is, to us, a service. So we're being able to give you a view into the collector or the users or the order or the catalog application that is running within this containerized world. So this is going to give you guys that insight and that visibility back to the business, where you guys still can start to consume the flexibility of Kubernetes and everything that it does have to offer. Question 2, so what groupings do we use, and are the teams consistent? Maybe the team A is using our production cluster and team B is using our development cluster, and what we're seeing is the different abstraction layers that we see. So you have the container, you have the pod, you have this construct of the namespace and the node and the disk. The disk is going to have a cost. The node is going to have a cost. The network transfer that I did not draw is going to have a cost, that pod, as well as that namespace. So Sometimes we like to ask customers, are you guys looking, do you want a cost per namespace or do you want a cost per pod? And sometimes namespace means different things to different teams within the organization. So team A, you can see here, that means developer. And team B, that means team. And I'm not here to say one way is right and one way is wrong, but something that I would encourage you guys to think about if you guys are going through this financial journey within Kubernetes or ECS or AKS, EKS, any cloud provider, any sort of container orchestration you guys are using, I would encourage you guys to have the conversation of let's identify some sort of consistency, whether that just be within our production cluster. That's where I need to allocate my costs. Let's just make sure that namespace is isolated and this is going to be representative of the product that we are running within our organization. Therefore, we can start to deliver that information back to the finance persona. Now, how do we do this? So obviously AWS, same thing with Azure. Google does it a little bit differently. I'm not going to talk about Google today, but AWS is going to be our main focus. You're getting this cloud bill. You have lines and lines of data. And really the core things that we need to identify is what is making up that Kubernetes infrastructure. We can start to group this by an auto-scaling group. We can group this by a cluster tag. Oftentimes EKS or your own form of Kubernetes on EC2 instances are often using a tag where we can start to identify the cost of production cluster, my cost of my development cluster, and my cost of my staging cluster, which is going to be representative of here's my overall cost of the clusters that I have running within my infrastructure. And then CloudHealth is just an example that I'm using for the mechanism of how we can then start to take those costs and break them down to cost by team. You can have a team A cost, a team B cost, and then breaking that into another dimension of cost by product and product B. So this is more of your traditional type of cost allocation where we're able to break those resources that we're seeing on a bill down by team and by product. But then obviously Kubernetes adds in that other layer and that abstract layer that we have to try to help customers allocating those costs to. So how do we distribute it? Do we know that there's a concept of resource request. I have namespace A and I've requested 50 gigabytes of memory. Do we want to charge them based on that 50 gigabytes of memory that they've actually requested? Or do we want to say out of the 50 gigabytes of memory that my namespace has requested, it only consume 10? Or do we charge each team based on their actual consumption? Within the industry today, we see the majority of the organizations leaning to the left, so looking at resource request. The reason why we see this often is it allocates all the cost. So namespace A is requested 50 gigabytes of memory. You're going to see the cost of that 50 gigabytes of memory, regardless if you've used that full 50 gigabytes of memory. And this also gives incentive back to those teams to say, only provision what you need. Be smart about the consumption, be smart about some of these configurations that we're looking at, because developers now have to start to think about cost where they traditionally didn't before. They're able to consume what basically the customer already owned or leased. Some of the challenges that we're seeing when customers are looking at this by request is they may not be setting these limits. They may not be setting these requests. And then also the second piece of that is we're under specifying requirements and applications are timing out. And then actual usage, another way that we can start to do this is if we just create a bucket of consumption or resources that have not been used, who's going to pay for those? Who should we deliver those costs back to the business? Should we just have one team be responsible for it? Or should we disperse it evenly across business units or teams? So there are some challenges that we do see in both approaches, but we oftentimes see that most customers are doing it by those resource requests. And this is going to be the added complexity layer that I had mentioned around Kubernetes. So again, we take the concept of those EC2 instances costing us X amount of dollars a month, and then we are going to create those costs into two buckets. So we have cluster A and cluster B. Now we need to understand within cluster A and cluster B, what are the actual applications that are running within those clusters? I'm going to say we represent those applications by namespace. So there's another data layer, we call it cost distribution, but what we're doing is we're going to distribute the cost of cluster A across the namespaces that are running within cluster A, and then we're going to take the cost of cluster B and distribute those across the namespaces that are running within cluster B. Therefore, you can then, at the end of the month, deliver a report to the finance team or deliver a report to the director or VP that may be asking for this information. Here's the cost of my application, here's the cost of my services, and these are the teams that are owning these costs. So again, playing more into that visibility phase that I had mentioned on the previous screen, going back to that cloud maturity model. Fourth question is, who pays for common services? This is something that customers, I would encourage you guys to talk about internally. Of you have logs, you have the cluster control plane, the data plane, the service mesh. Oftentimes we are seeing customers put these in buckets and distributing them across different teams, doing it based on a percentage or a flat fee. But this is oftentimes something that we see customers discussing and having conversations with to ensure consistency across the different product lines. Therefore, we will be able to deliver that total cost of those products back to the business. And then the fifth, I know optimization opportunities within Kubernetes. Pod right sizing is something that is relating back to the slide that you had seen before around requests versus actual usage. So being able to identify and holding the developers accountable or the engineers accountable to say, you guys requested 50 gigabytes of memory, but only consumed 10. Why is that? What are ways that we can start to identify the request limits and making sure that we are closer to running more efficiently? Auto scaling. There are open source tools that I know individuals have used on the market. That's going to be more of your virtual auto scaling, where it'll actually change the YAML. It'll say, hey, well, you've consistently used 10 gigabytes. I'm going to change the YAML and we're only going to request that 10 gigabytes of memory. Node right sizing, we're looking at a collection of nodes that are running a cluster. You can start to look at it from a performance perspective as well, saying maybe I should migrate to a different workload, or even taking into account modernizations. Fifth generation of an instance has come out. Let's migrate the fourth generation to that fifth generation, which is going to obviously decrease your costs monthly, but increase that performance overall. And then if you're not familiar with any of the discounts from AWS or Google or Azure, something else that you guys can start to take advantage of is savings plans. So being able to commit a certain amount of compute to these cloud providers, which will in return reduce the amount of spend that you guys have running your Kubernetes workloads. And then just going into some of the customer spotlights, these are some of the deals that I myself have worked on in the past, specific to Kubernetes and that visibility phase. A lot of the time, customers are entering this world of, hey, we're just starting. Maybe we're testing out Kubernetes where we were using ECS before, and now we're changing over to EKS. The visibility phase is really the main one that I have seen today, getting a grasp on those costs, understanding my applications, understanding my products, understanding my services and my teams that are consuming those pods and those namespaces. And then obviously continue into that next phase of, now I understand my cost, I understand where those are going in my business. Now I want to identify how can we start to run more efficiently. Continuing to tell that story, continuing to give that visibility back to the business.